When it was finally confirmed by humanity about sentient species from beyond their own planet, everybody wanted to know who or what they were, and of course, how to meet them. Because of this desire, everything shifted to one purpose, and that's getting off-world so they could stretch beyond their cradle planet and they could mingle with everyone else. As humanity reached beyond its own system, utilizing a primitive FTL and eventually going up to much better ones, they found the other species deep in the void. They also found an abhorrent practice they thought they had left behind. Upon learning the use of slaves is commonplace upon all species in the void, most humans made it a point to follow the certain rules to make sure they didn't get caught up in that BS. The rules were, don't gamble with Xenos. Ever. Never, under any circumstances, sign anything without a human lawyer present. Because of this rule in particular, the sight of a human lawyer showing up is enough to make most Xenos back off of one of their twisty deals really, really quick. The next rule was always be strapped, and if you have to use it, don't be stingy with the bullets. Keep shooting until you have to reload, and if you have to, keep going. The next rule, never travel outside Seoul with children. The rule after that, if you didn't bring it, you don't drink it. Ever. That rule was exceptionally high for females of the human species. And of course, another rule was, when in doubt, draw your weapon. It's better to make people nervous than somebody getting the drop on you. And the final rule, above all else, never, ever deal with the Ferengi, as they will trick you somehow, and human slaves are so rare, they make good profit. Though at this point humans hadn't seen it up close, it is fairly common for species to enslave their own for sale for different reasons, war usually being high on the list, but only during certain parts when there is a high amount of conflict. Financial, of course, if you can't afford it. Selling off one of your own for food falls under this one. Of course, there are criminal slaves as well, and sometimes one will even offer slavery to themselves if it's their only option to survive, either that or a slow, agonizing, cold, guaranteed death. The results are never good for anybody in this market. Normally, if they're a worker slave, they're worked until they just can't move anymore. Some are used as a master's pleasure doll, where one would think that these slaves would get some sort of special treatment, but more often than not, what would happen is once the master is done pleasing themselves, they would simply throw this slave to the master's pets as food. Slaves were known to barely get fed. If they did, they have to fight for what food is there, unless the master wants to plump them up for one reason or another. The reason why they don't feed them well is food costs. Food costs a lot. Clothing is also rarely received, and hygiene is almost never given. This is because if they die of some sort of disease, the masters can usually afford to simply get another slave to put in their place. There's also the arrangements where they must sleep. If they're on planet, they're usually stuck on the cold ground or the freezing cold of a ship's deck plating. It's a very miserable existence, yet slaves are still treated poorly due to being so damn cheap and easy to get a hold of. This all began to change when the first human freighter reached out and docked with a non-human station. They docked on the membrane station, and even after they got done offloading their cargo and loading back on what they were supposed to, many of the crew started to walk around, and the first things they would say are things like, "This place is insane," or, "I've never seen such a wretched hive of scum and villainy before." Many of the crew needed to look around because, well, they'd never been there before, and they were curious. Yet as they were looking around, that's when they found the form of a putty snake-like form of a Ferengi sitting right next to a bunch of young slaves chained to the wall. By human eyes, these slaves ranged from about 13 to 27 if they figure, each one keeping their head down, most not even wearing clothing, looking completely emaciated and covered with bruises. The human crew was immediately caught looking as the fat snake slithered over to make his deal. His four stubby arms moved around with each word, trying to emphasize what he was saying. The humans, though, paid him little mind before asking, Why are they all chained up? Immediately, the Ferengi said, "All slaves for sale," as though he was just trying to push his goods. The humans were angry, and they were quiet. They all stared at those that were still chained up. As their blood boiled, one of the humans simply turned and asked about the price, surprised that they would just have to trade a few items that can't be produced outside of Earth. The following items consisted, one, of 4 cases of vegetable oil. When asked why vegetable oil, it turns out that this is actually a very exquisite liquor for the Valvanus. They also need to have 25 gallons of crude oil. When refined the correct way, it turns into a bathing fluid for the Gyardos, and it affects them the same way that a tub of bath salts would for a human. They also had to bring in a half a liter of tartrazine, which is just about enough to get every Ferengi on the planet below them a little loopy, very oiled, and tripping freaking balls for a week. This was all they needed to free all 11 slaves, and it did take a minute for them to get all this together, as they realized that these items could be traded, so they simply got a hold of the crew and got everything they could together. With that, the sale was complete. Heading back to the human ship, all the slaves were frightened as they didn't know anything about the species that now held the chain that was bringing to their ship. They saw the massive ship. It was a strange metal thing. They'd never seen something so lacking in ornamentation. They believed that they would be the ornamentation, if anything. They walked in, there was very little in the way of color. It was very drab. And once on board, they were shocked to find their bonds were immediately removed once the doors were shut. Then they were all led into an area where they actually had hot water spray on them for the first time, and they were given some sort of strange bar that they didn't understand. They had to be shown how to use it to clean themselves, and they were simply starting to be happy about this. Once they were done, they were walked down for a full health screening as the ship began to take off. They were also given new clothes, which didn't seem to be anything special, but these were new fabrics. New clothes was something that you never got for slaves. And before anything else happened, they were given a small bit of food, mostly just soup and a little bit of bread, and they were brought over to makeshift beds that at least got them off the deck, and for the first time ever, they thought, either they're treating us good because they want to kill us, or actually, I don't know why else they'd want to do that. Before the frigate returned 2.7 years later, the word had already spread about the slave market, and soon after the word went around, it seemed like every single human ship began to show up with plenty to trade with. They traded so much that they actually drained the slaves so fast that the slave market actually began to run out. When they tried to refill the stocks, they found an issue. As it turns out, humans had begun to cut out the middleman and started landing ships directly on the homeworlds so that they could get slaves themselves. The goods they traded were all items that could make them extremely wealthy, yet it seems as though the humans had a different purpose, a singular purpose. This put an excessive amount of strain on those that shipped and sold slaves for a living. So much so that there was a lot of tension building up within just a couple of years before the frigate had even returned. And when it did, it turned out that the slaves were now working on the ship. They all walked out in fresh uniforms, cleaning out the ship, trading in goods, and then returning, many times buying their own slaves and bringing that on. It was strange to see, and this also strained everything more and more and more, as now the stocks were pretty much gone. Everything came to a head as the Ferengi and Gyardos slave fleets, about 12 each, arrived in the Eros homeworld. They had come to this planet specifically because the Eros sell for a very high price, and there's always more of them to buy once they land on the planet. They wouldn't say this, but as it turns out, the Ferengi and Gyardo have actually sabotaged the planet, making it very difficult to grow enough food to maintain its current population, and this forces many to sell a child or two just to survive. However, to their horror, as they look through their sensors, there's two very large human heavy freighters already on the ground. They had made planetfall, and a human destroyer was in orbit, watching over them. One of the human freighters, as they watched, was offloading heavy farming equipment alongside machinery designed to fix the air and soil. These machines were very specific and easy to recognize by any species. In a panic, the Gyardo actually tried to claim that what the humans were doing was illegal, and immediately brought up the issue. When the humans demanded proof, the Gyardo claimed that they didn't need any. So the humans and the Eros just kept going, not giving a shit, and not allowing the Gyardo or Ferengi to land. When the Gyardo actually did send proof, within 7 minutes, the human lawyers had sent over their rebuttal, effectively shredding the claims by showing that everything they said was a total lie. Realizing that they were stuck and they didn't want to get in any more trouble with any of the other species, the Gyardo withdrew, only to find out the same thing was happening on other planets and colonies everywhere. It seems as though the humans were hell-bent on making sure that the slave trade had dried up. The Ferengi didn't want to give up so easily. Claiming their ship malfunctioned, they dropped enough of the biological agent into the atmosphere to sterilize the entire planet, flora and fauna alike. If they can't make profit on the Eros, then nobody and nothing will, was their way of thinking. The human destroyer immediately saw this, scanned it, realized what was going on, and fired on the contents, destroying almost all of it before it even touched the exosphere. They burned everything and warned everybody below about what was happening. The Ferengi claimed that the humans actually fired on a peaceful ship, forcing them to drop their cargo, and the humans must be forced into servitude in order to repay them for the profits that they had lost. Even when this was brought in front of the courts, in front of every single species, as the evidence mounted against the Ferengi, they demanded compensation, claiming that they were the victims. There is no way that they could possibly be the aggressors. Yet as the trial continued, humans still purchased slaves at what the known universe would consider a high price, and this eventually starved the Ferengi business. The only thing they really had left was the Ferengi smuggling practices that had now, thanks to the court, become well known, and less species would deal with them, to the point where they would renege on contracts. They would turn around, complete contracts, and then forcibly enslave everybody that they made a contract with under penalty of death. They would beat them. They would force them down and do horrible things to them until their minds broke and sold them. Yet as these broken slaves were sent in the mix with a few slaves that still permeated the galaxy, you can slow down something like this. You can never stop it. The slaves around the galaxy found themselves in better conditioning. Now that grabbing replacements was not easy thanks to the humans, the masters had to treat all the slaves better because now they were much more valuable commodity. Yet, there is a new phrase that echoes through all the slaves as word got out how well they would be treated by the humans if a human became their masters. They knew that humans loved to use regeneration pods for health, and they would share these with the slaves. It was normal to see humans walking around that looked like they're youthful, yet the human in question might be decades, if not hundreds of years old. And they would share these with the slaves, and they would regrow the parts that had been removed by the slave masters. They also knew that humans did not like starving anyone. It seems as though humans have gone through this before, and they would make sure that regular meals were there. Not only just regular meals, but flavorful meals were there. Something you actually looked forward to, not just to fill your belly, but something that you could enjoy. They also knew that there was going to be some sort of medical care. The humans would actually make sure before you even got to their ship that if you were bruised or broken in some way, they would treat you. They also thought about the warm, soft beds. This was definitely one that went around, thinking how the humans always set them up in a warm, soft bed, giving them plenty of blankets and making sure that they were not sleeping on the cold ground or, heaven forbid, the cold deck plating. And what truly surprised them all was that they did not have to walk around without protective clothing. They always had clothing, even though sometimes it was a bit sparse. They were going to have clothing dependent on what they had to do. And even though most would simply be made to work for a certain amount of time, others had taken place of children for humans that didn't have any. It was surprising to many of them, especially those that were, by human eyes, the age of 10 or younger, who were brought in and simply taught as children, sent to their education, and made sure that they learned so that when they finished up, they could actually go out and be productive. The whole time being told to call their master either mommy or daddy. A few do end up in the role of lover, though it is rare for a human male to take more than 3 for this role. 1 is the standard. A human female, however, typically has 5 male slaves at her beck and call. In spite of the fact that the interbreeding is completely impossible, humans don't seem to mind much. Yet they do have this strange thing about clothing that may cover but can be seen through. Above all else, through all the things humans do, there's one thing that surprised everyone above all. They give the former slaves a choice to stay and work or to go home. With all the planets fixed and production going well, some do choose to return once they have earned enough. Usually after several human years of working, they've earned enough where they can go home. They have enough of their own supplies that they can return and be productive with their own kind as well. Those are usually manual labors, or those that were raised by humans, as they always dreamed of going home. Yet it seems as though the humans, even though they let these ones go, don't ever like to see those that they raised leave, as they do this strange thing that no other species does. They smile while they cry. One of the things that surprised the humans from the slaves was that most of the former slaves used for pleasure decided they wanted to stay. The reason being is though their clothing is sparse, it is extremely comfortable. Their lives are nothing but parties and pleasure whenever they choose it. They end up having some of the best food and travel, and makes them all say the phrase that echoes amongst all those awaiting to be purchased, still in chains. Make sure that the human purchases you, because it's always best to be in a human harem. When humans heard of this, many of them were confused and would always asked those that they had purchased and freed immediately, why did they want to be part of a human's harem? They said, no, a human harem. Every human was confused and wanted to understand this, and it turns out there is a completely different meaning to that word. Harem for them simply means a group of slaves that had been purchased by humans. One of the best reactions to this news was actually caught on a video where one man who had just purchased a whole bunch of prepubescents and actually pulled the chains off himself heard this definition, and one could see the relief on his face. He said, "Oh, thank God. Holy crap, I thought I was going to get arrested for sure." That's when he motioned to a human female on the ship and looked at the children and said, "Okay, kids, you go with mommy, okay?" Hello, everybody. This is Syntax. Thank you for joining me on today's short story. Before I go, I need to send out some special thank yous to a few of my supporters, and those will be Prozac and Pancakes, SS Demon, Erica Gem, Brian Kemp, Guardian Sage, and Sir. Thank you all for supporting the channel. Everybody else, I'll see you on the next one. This is Syntax, punching out.